John, thanks for coming on the show.
Hey, thanks for having me on, man.
Yeah. So we were just catching up on F1 and how big it's getting, I guess, from the Netflix show and everything, and just what an interesting way it is to digest a sport like that, because it's like so much about like the Game of Thrones machinations and the teams and everything like that. And so I guess kind of a wild starting question: are there any parallels? People are always using sports metaphors for business and everything. Do you ever make connections between what's going on in F1 and what you see in the B2B market research space?
That's an interesting question. But I mean, one of the things that we did talk about was the idea that like where it's not like it is you think about all these guys, and for anybody who hasn't seen it, it's the Netflix show Drive to Survive, right? If I got the title right. And they've had 3 seasons out about F1. They got us so excited about it that we're actually going to go to our first F1 race as a family down in Austin at Coda in October. And a place where it's not like it is you see these guys all living in the paddock, all these high-end teams, trading drivers on a regular basis, right? And you can't even imagine that in the B2B world. It's like, 7 B2B companies sharing a corporate campus, or something like that. Like, I can't even imagine that. I think, probably the bigger thing might be just it's, in terms of like you do have a lot of factors that lead to you winning in B2B, and they're not necessarily incredibly obvious to the casual observer. I would say that would be the biggest thing. Most people have a lot of experience with B2C, right? And you can maybe make an analogy to NASCAR, like, they'll say, well, that's a Pontiac chassis or whatever, right? Not that they really make Pontiacs anymore, but I dated myself. But you know what I mean? They've got like, recognizable kind of brands and companies and whatever. And I'm not that big of a NASCAR fan, not to make half your audience just turn off or something, but like, I'm not.
I guess it's a lot of our audience, like in the agency world, probably very few NASCAR fans, but
no, that's fair. That's fair. I mean, there's a great country song I like called Left Turn, which is a great country song for driving, but it's obviously a NASCAR inspired song. Yeah. And so, but where I was going with that is like, I think for most people, the problem with B2B, and it's even an issue when we hire, and it's even an issue, I think, when you have an agency that tries to cross B2B and B2C, B2B is a lot more opaque, right? It just is. I mean, like, you do not have the same personal experience of the buying process. In B2C, a lot of times I think, like, for example, an agency can very quickly come up to speed on a client's business because it's like, oh, I buy groceries too. I buy cars too. I understand the retail channel. I go to the retail channel every week, right? Or I don't do that, or I buy my stuff all over Amazon. So, but with B2B, it's almost impossible to understand the client's business unless you've either been doing it for a while or you bother to geek out on it. Like, one of my favorite interview questions that I've asked for years as we've grown the firm is, tell me about a technology that's not sold in Best Buy. And what happens is about half the people we interview go, I don't know, and it's like, okay, well, you won't work here. You're a nice person, but you won't work here, right? And then the other half, like, will say something that no one else has ever heard of, right? Whether it's a particular cloud service or, some kind of AI implementation or big data implementation or whatever. And I feel like the analogy between F1 and NASCAR would be kind of similar. Like, Drive to Survive has broken down that kind of opaque wall on F1 that to most people, the only real difference they thought is, well, they make more turns and they make lefts and rights. You know what I mean? That was about the extent of like how they would see the difference. And when you really look at F1, I mean, I don't know. I mean, I don't know how to make too many comparisons to NASCAR, but I remember we read one last thing. I mean, we read this book called The Chariot Makers that was written by a really famous F1 mechanic. And even back in the day, most people may not know this, you can drive an F1 car upside down. It has enough downforce that, like, once it's going about 100 miles an hour or something like that, you could literally drive it on the ceiling. And so, there's things like that, your average individual just doesn't really appreciate. So you start watching the sport for a while. And I think that's part of what I think is cool about it. And I do think there's this kind of opaqueness to it in the beginning. And I feel, last thing, I even feel bad saying that because Brian, one of our marketers, is a huge F1 fan. and he grew up in Singapore. So it's probably bad of me to say that it's a hard sport to get into, but once you're into it, I think it's fantastic.
Yeah, and that's really interesting. You touched on so much, and I think my thought on it is that regardless of whether it's B2B or B2C, and I thought of this while you were talking, is that I think the parallel with just business in general is just how much uncertainty there is, how many variables there are, how much chaos there is, right? Where in F1, like in basketball or football, it's like, okay, it's the athleticism. It's like, there's lots of variables, but there's way fewer variables than in a situation where it's, with F1, where it's your funding, it's your mechanics, it's your engineers, it's your driver, it's the course conditions, it's all sorts of other things. And then the past year you had COVID kind of throwing a wrench in the gears where you could do everything perfectly and then have something small that you might never really determine, create a situation where your odds are way worse. So I think that's
Well, on that point, another thing that you could tie in between F1 and B2B is like in B2B, there is a much bigger buying chain, and that creates all these kind of different dynamics, right? You can't have just an emotional purchase because the purchase is going to take 3, 6, 9 months. So yes, emotion impacts every purchase known to man, forever will. I don't care if it's a cloud computing service or not. But the rationality creeps in more the longer that purchase sits and the decision has to be made. And the analogy I think you could easily draw there with F1 is, I love baseball, right? I appreciate basketball. I don't watch it as much as baseball. I love football. But let's be honest, you watch your average American sport, and baseball is probably the least of this. But, somebody hits a home run. It's like, me, I hit the home run, right? Or I dunked the ball, or you know what I mean? Whatever. In F1, what happens every time they win? Usually the driver, while going 150 on his cooldown lap, the first thing he says is, hey, great job, team. Thanks for giving me a great car to drive. F1 almost by definition, which is kind of strange given how intense that sport is from the physicality of it, right? And the danger in it. They are very much of the mindset that the driver is not all that it is. And you can even see that, and we're not trying to tune people out on F1, maybe it's the last thing. Mercedes is winning. Hamilton's a good driver, no doubt. Maybe a great driver. I mean, history will always tell that. I mean, he's won so many titles. But let's be honest, the other guy driving with him usually comes in second. And, one of the teams got called Tracing Point because they tried to copy the Mercedes car. Right. You know what I mean? And ended up coming in third the minute they copied the car. So clearly the car has something to do with it, right? So you got a whole army of people engineering the vehicle, right? And that just doesn't happen in basketball. It's not like somebody gives LeBron James an engineered basketball, right? He has the same basketball as everybody else. So the court's the same size. So it somewhat is about him, more or less, right? And so in that, again, the B2C, B2B thing is kind of similar there. You've got a limited number of people involved in the purchase in B2C. It's mostly about them. Emotion can rule the day. They can just overwhelm their opponent kind of emotionally and say, I want to go buy this. And that happens probably in a lot of households. I really want to go get this. And then in B2B, you have this very rational machine-like purchasing behavior that has lots of emotion in it, but it clearly, all those players have to get addressed. And that makes marketing different. That makes sales different. That makes all kinds of things different.
Yeah, that's a great point. And maybe it's something like where F1 becomes a better metaphor for what it's like between a CEO and his or her company. So anyway, to shift gears off that, people, I think you touched on something that's really big, and we always hear this, that consumers are irrational, B2B is rational, right? So I'd love to hear your thoughts on that. Do you think that's actually true, and how do you see that playing out from the research you're doing?
Well, one of the things we refer to a lot is this thing called the B2B Hierarchy of Needs, and Bain put it together, the big management consulting firm. And we reference it a lot to clients, and it gets it exactly, I think, what you're talking about. They have this hierarchy of needs. It's kind of like Maslow. It's like the 5-layer kind of thing. If people don't remember Maslow from high school or psych classes in college, you have at the bottom, which are like essential needs. And then you have like self-actualization at the top. And what they've done is they did a huge survey of like B2B buyers and a ton of research. And this is also played out in our research too. I mean, we see the same trends. But they're bigger than us. We're only 25 employees. Bain's been a household name for 40 years. So the B2B hierarchy of needs starts out with, hey, does my product meet spec? Is it performant? What's the cost? then it gets into a little bit more of like ease of use and integration as you go up the stack. But the higher up you go, there is a certain amount of, and I don't have it in front of me, but folks can go look it up. But as you go higher up the stack, there's things in there that are kind of more self-actualization-esque. Like, does this lead to personal success for me in my career if I authorize this solution or this purchase, right? Will I be perceived as a leader in the company or a loser if I make the wrong purchase, right? So I think it's emotional, but it's a different kind of emotional, right? It's not about like, do I feel good using this piece of business software, right? I mean, sure, there are some pieces of business software that aspire to that level. No one has ever felt love for Microsoft products. You know what I mean? Like, some people will feel that way about Apple products. I do, but even I don't think my Mac is perfect. There's things about it that, although I'll admit a free plug for Apple, the M1 laptops are absolutely insane and magical devices. And I can't wait for them to get to whatever the M2 is. But the reality is, even there, I have rational mixed with emotional reasons why I'm buying this thing, right? It's not just an impulse buy, like, a York's peppermint patty in the checkout line at the grocery store, right? It's not like that, So I do think there's emotion, but I think it's much more related to how maybe you're perceived as a leader, how your career track goes based on that decision. And, I don't think those are the same thing as on the B2C side.
Yeah, that's interesting. So there's still a huge emotional element, but it's like maybe more about self-protection and furthering your career,
it's growth, or
safety.
It's positively it's growth, or negatively it's self-protection. And to be honest, I wish this wasn't true, but like I think more often than not, B2B companies buy defensively.
Yeah.
And that's been proven out by all kinds of research. Like you read Crossing the Chasm. What's the bulk of buyers? They're pragmatists and conservatives, right? Gartner has their hype cycle curve, where on the far end of the curve, it's like the slope of enlightenment, which is clearly like a pragmatic buyer, right? So however you look at like technology adoption, the grand bulk of people tend to buy it somewhat carefully. And so I think that also tends to lead to a lack of emotion when it comes to the purchase. And again, if someone's listening and saying emotion's part of it, I see it all the day, I'm a seller, I'm not saying it's not. I mean, you have to relate to people, you have to engage with their needs, you have to understand kind of their base needs. But if it's a 6 to 9 month purchase cycle and there's 5 to 9 people involved, that's going to mute and kind of retract some of that emotion, if only because you got all these different perspectives in the buying committee, right? And where are they going to turn to in a meeting around a conference table? One of them isn't going to say to the other one and just pound their fist on the table like it's a movie scene, let's buy it now. They're going to make rational arguments, because that's what people tend to do in business meetings, for better or worse, because sometimes the rational argument isn't always the best one. Gut instinct is a good thing. But, we all know how committee meetings work. What did somebody say once? I think it was Twain. A camel is a horse designed by a committee, or something like that, if I remember right. So like, it's not that it's a great decision. It's just, that's how the decisions get made.
Yeah, I love that. And it reminds me of The Challenger Sale, which is a book that I love, because it's like, it's grounded in so much research, so much data. And to me, it almost, maybe you have different opinions of it, which I'd love to hear, but it seems to me like the spiritual sequel to Spin Selling. I think Neil Rackham wrote the forward and everything, and it's been proven out, I think, pretty well. And they have a whole section about what they call rational drowning, right? Which is like, in a B2B sales context, you're getting to this place where people are going to go through this rational exercise anyway, so you might as well guide it and basically let people drown in the numbers. And,
Well,
let me give you the floor and hear your thoughts on that. Yeah.
Oh, well, I would just say I love that book. I think that's great. I mean, there are seminal sales books that kind of really point a different direction that matter. But I think it gets at something we've, at the same time, those business books most of the time are successful because they're telling us something we know that's elemental about human nature in buying and selling, but they've done it in kind of a really unique way. I mean, I'm sure there was a book called The Challenger Sale in Latin in Rome in 100 AD. You know what I mean? Like, they were buying different things, wheat and bread and olive oil, but I'm sure there was kind of some guy out there doing the Challenger sale in 100 AD. And to me, there's two things that, and there are many things from the Challenger sale, but two things that have always stood out to me kind of related to it and from it. If you ask good questions, you win. You just do. I mean, it's much better to ask good questions than to speak all the way through, which is funny because the podcast format forces me to say a lot and I don't get to ask questions. You do. But like, if I'm talking to a client, I'm asking lots and lots and lots of questions, and that's the way our sales team operates. And even our website has lots and lots of questions that we answer, kind of thing. And the second thing is the Challenger sale by definition would force you to say no to somebody every once in a while. And I've won way more business over the years by saying no, whether that's no to an audience or no to a market segment that we don't want to go after. And I make that line really crisp, or it's no in a sales conversation. And I think that just comes down to the fact that, I don't know, if there was a trustometer on the planet, it keeps getting lower every decade, right? I trust my fellow human being? Like right now we're in not exactly a high watermark for that. And because of that, I think the person who looks at someone else in the eye and says, no, I don't do that. The other person says, oh my God, thank you. Like, that's awesome. Like now I know whatever else comes out of your mouth, at least it's more likely that you do that well. Right. And but you can't do that to the Challenger. So you can't do any of that unless you understand who that client is in their context. Because now if you just throw stuff out there that's generic, you've done worse than probably just letting them talk at that point.
Yeah. And I think even bigger than that is that there's information parity more so between buyers and sellers. So it's less like some kind of old sales tactic where you're like asking lots of questions and then creating some mold of clay to present to somebody. And it's more about like, here's what we're doing. It's right for these people. It's not right for these others. And is it something that we can make work? And I think that's kind of what I'm getting at. Yeah.
The only thing I push back though on that part from the book is that I think that depends a little bit. The idea that like everybody has the same set of information. I mean, yes, it's true. Like compared, like for example, when my dad sold small group health insurance, he passed away, unfortunately, a few years back. I love my dad, but he's a seller his whole life. And he sold small group health insurance, 100% commission, going out and like cold calling people on Monday and getting people to write checks by Friday. I mean, that's probably like the hardest selling the only harder selling job I think is being the F&I guy in a dealership.
Right. Or being a Mormon out knocking on doors. That's probably the hardest.
Right. There are harder things to do in life for sure. Right. But what I would say is that at the end of the day, where I'm going with that is in his era, pre-internet, all that stuff, all the information was on the salesperson's side. Yes, they knew everything about the policy, the premium, and the other person didn't have really alternatives. But here's the funny thing. For example, with large company sales, just to give you one example, we love our large company clients, but the truth is many people go to work for a large company and never leave it, even today, or they go to one other large company or at most two. And so what ends up happening a lot of times is the consultant, and of course you have to do this appropriately. There's non-disclosure agreements and all kinds of things that you're not supposed to say about one person's business to another, but you understand some general principles about the market because you are interacting with more entities directly than anybody else. And that's not going to be on a web page. But again, the only way you could make that work for you is if you pick somewhat of a lane and stick to it. Because if you're peanut buttered your agency all over the place, if you're doing project on M&Ms one week and pharma drugs the next and cloud services the next, you have no perspective that isn't found on the internet. You just don't. The only perspective you have is the other thing the client can Google. But if you've worked with, like in our lane, if you do AWS, Google, Microsoft, Salesforce, IBM, HP, Dell, well, at some point, I'm going to figure out something that is 100% appropriate to say that isn't proprietary information. It's the same thing as a builder who builds homes for a living and all they do is single family homes like my father-in-law did. After a while, he picks up some trends. He knows exactly what's going on. And those trends aren't necessarily going to be on a blog post or those insights, right? And so, but again, the only way you get there is if you say no to certain things that you're going to take on. It's the only way you would gain that perspective and maintain it.
And gain that sort of sixth sense, fingertip feel, as they say. So I guess one question I have is, it seems like, in the research, the consulting space, there's kind of like understandable incentives, just like there are in any other space. So it's not any better or worse to either tell people what they want to hear, because like say a company wants to do a certain thing and they want to validate it. So that's the worst incentive. And then the more benign, but still kind of like, problematic incentive is to tell a clean story when there may or may not be one because the data is unclear. So first, I'd just love to hear, assuming you agree with that, and if so, how do you deal with that problem?
Well, yes, we deal with it, but do you mean more like when we deliver research? Do you mean more just like general interaction with clients? What do you mean in that sense?
I guess all of the above. And I was thinking of it more in terms of when you deliver research. What happens when there's a situation where you're like, where the data says there's not a clear amount of signal here, it's too anecdotal, but it seems like there might be an incentive to say, here's what's actually going on when it's not exactly clear. So I just love to hear your thoughts.
Yeah. No, it happens a lot. I mean, there's a very, very large software company that sells, and I won't say it's a productivity solution, but that's broad enough, I think, that they had horrible digital demand gen. And that was the main reason they didn't have uptake. I won't, if I get too specific, it'll give away who the client is. In our line of work, I can tell you a lot about the project and not say the client name, or I can say the client name and not a lot about the project. That's kind of the way it works. And so no one's going to hear who the client name is as much as they want to. And basically we kept sending in the findings deck, and this slide kept getting moved farther back. That was like, you guys have this incredibly horrible digital presence in SEO with Google. It's like brain dead for how big you guys are. I don't understand why this is so bad. And it kept getting shunted. And what we came to realize was there was a vice president who was eventually going to be in the readout, who had basically commissioned the strategy that was a loser. And so the slide, our goal in that case is we just have to bring it up and be authentic. Another one of my favorite ones is we were doing research on, again, I got to think of how I lay these things out sometimes, a particular end user computing device that everybody would know, and slightly non-traditional, let's say, right? And so we were doing research on it, and our client wanted to know what its uptake was going to be and adoption. And this is kind of a device that everybody's heard of. And so at the end of the presentation, the client was one of those clients that kind of felt like, hey, this is an upstart kind of device, et cetera. We're probably not a threat to us. So our analyst, and I love he did this is Tyler, he actually goes ahead and at the end of the presentation says, and by the way, I delivered the entire presentation on this device. And the client's like, what? And now we've delivered that readout, I think, like 5 different times, because so sometimes I think it's just penetrating that veil that they want to put up with some really, really solid information. Other times it's just being super plain spoken. I mean, I hate to say this, but I got the vice president of sales in the UK fired for a Fortune 100 software company once, because there was this quote in the findings that said that your salespeople are asterisk, ampersand, exclamation mark, insert your word there, right? And the minute you guys are number 2 in the market, I'm never buying you again. And what this company had done is they kept shipping Silicon Valley sales execs to Western Europe to start up divisions and practices. And they had no idea the culture. They were flying some, frankly, young kid from like San Jose or Santa Clara or San Francisco and dropping him out of a parachute in Birmingham, England, and saying, go make something happen. And everybody was like, it's like this guy's using napalm. Like, this is not going to work, right? And the client was blind to it because they were still number 1, but they were number 1 for very different reasons than the effectiveness of their sales team, right? But I'm sure that's not what their sales team thought. And so there's a lot of times where you just have to keep this stuff real. But at the end of the day, I remember something one of my MBA students, when I taught an MBA program for a while, I taught industry analysis and competitive intelligence. This frankly slightly smarmy kid comes up to me and he says, hey, this is all really great, but do you still get paid if they don't change their mind? And I said, okay, all right, Padawan. I am not getting paid enough to make 100,000 people change their mind. Like people, elections are harder to win, or easier to win probably than that decision. You know what I mean? I'd rather run for office and try to get 100,000 people to vote for me. And I had to explain it to him, like, you just don't control all of that. So, so if you sum it up, it's clarity, it's a willingness to scrap. And that's probably a really key thing too. A lot of times inside companies, there's kind of a default truce. Like one side says a negative opinion, the other side gives a negative opinion, and very quickly they ratchet back to some truce line. The blue hats come out, everybody goes back to their corners, right? The UN stands between the warring sides and it's all over. All it sometimes takes is the consultant is to just bring it up one more time and kind of give license for people to start arguing. And the last best example of that I could think of is there was a client of ours who reached out to us once. It was a CMO, one of the best form fills I've ever seen. It said, hey, we service 3,000 different personas and we have a problem. And they meant it. They were a SaaS app that had never said no to anything. And so now they had all these different user segments to serve and market to, and they had high cost of customer acquisition, all the stuff you might imagine out of that. And we were going through all of the sales process and pre-up to get things. And, there's like 14 people on a Zoom window, all trying to decide on us and somebody else. And the guy said to me, this guy from the East Coast, kind of with a chip on his shoulder. And I like people from the East Coast. I grew up in Chicago, but chip on his shoulder a bit, says, so why should we pick you? And I've been like, okay, this has been like an hour of all this stuff. And so I looked into the camera and I said, because we're going to stop you from arguing. And he paused and he just cackled and then they all laughed because they're like, oh, okay, you're right. That's your job as the researcher, to make us quit arguing, right? To make these arguments stop. Yeah. And when we stay focused on that, we do really well. But all that to say, big companies do dumb things in spite of the research. And I could give you 25 minutes at least of examples there, but we do our best. And some of those things are the ways we go about making it happen.
Yeah, that's super interesting. I love all clarity, willingness to scrap, the idea of just kind of like being an outsider that can kind of create peace because you have less of a horse in the race. So I think that makes a lot of sense. You touched on something kind of interesting where, I think a lot of companies are successful in doing horrible things in spite of their success, and the thing that's making them successful has nothing to do with like the horrible things that they're doing. And sometimes I think you get kind of a survivorship bias where, there's a company that's these companies that we love, like Apple or whatever, where we look at the wrong thing and then say that this is why they're successful. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on that. Like, are there any reoccurring dynamics that you see where people think, okay, this is why we're so great, is because we're doing this thing, and actually you're like, no, this is something horrible that you're doing that you need to stop doing, and so on. So I'd love to just dig into that a little more. Yeah.
Well, one of the things that there's a book called Stall Points that I think all of American business or anywhere business should read. Most of the examples are American companies, which is why I say that, but it's a fantastic book and it ties exactly into what you're talking about. It gives all these examples of companies that reach kind of their maximum profit potential and then never got back to it again. It's kind of like getting to the highest ski lift on the hill, and then years later, either through age or you just don't want to do it anymore, risk it, you never take that high run again. You're always kind of lower down on the hill. And I'm a big skier, so I think about that. Hopefully I'll always hit the higher run, but someday I'm going to get older too. I'm 50, almost 51 now. So someday I want to actually go take every black. But the book said one of the more common examples, and I see this all the time, is if you look at the board or the head of a company, the leadership team, look and see when they started with the company, were they working in basically the cash cow business unit? So for a Microsoft, that would have been Windows. For an Apple, that would have been like the original Mac business or something like that, right? For Google, it would have been search. And what happens is this myopia sets in and this kind of sense of dominance sets in and they can't do anything right. And that's been written about all over the place. Like the innovator's dilemma is a good example of that. And so I would say one of the biggest things is that kind of what's the tenure of people I'm dealing with and where did they come from? One of my favorite examples of that for years was, we've done a fair amount of work with Microsoft over the years. And you could almost date the year Microsoft employees started working from the company. This no longer happens, but this happened for a long time. They would look at you and you'd be scoping a research project and you would say, well, what kind of organization should we target for the research? And they would say, a 5,000 seat organization. Now, you know what that means? That means 5,000 people using Windows because they were coming from the era where everybody used Windows. And so you just said the number of seats. I mean, think about this for a minute. Like it makes you want to call the DOJ, I guess. And they did, but they basically just assumed that an organization that had 5,000 people had 5,000 licensed copies of Windows, right? And so they just said it like that. Well, it was a stumbling block for them for years, that kind of view of the world in a way, because what changed? Well, there's cloud services and not everybody has a Windows license and the Mac starts to charge back. And then you've got Chromebooks and you've got people just using mobile phones that aren't running a version of Windows. We all know that Windows Mobile didn't exactly take the world by storm, right? And so, there's this kind of even language and way of talking about the market that creeps in and it blinds you from actually seeing what's happening. Now, Microsoft now has evolved past that. They have a bunch of popular cloud services. They understand that a 11-person organization like Instagram before it was purchased can soak an amazing amount of compute power that's way more than 11 users in a small, publishing house somewhere or whatever, right? So, they evolve, but I think that myopia will sometimes turn into language, and then that language turns into chains that kind of sit on top of every conversation and every view of the market. And then nobody can see the real world through all those chains they've set up, right? And so it's things like that that get in the way.
Yeah, that's super interesting. Just to clarify, so in that book, Stall Points, when they're talking about leaders coming from the cash cow sectors, is the argument that's what kind of creates a false sense of ability, and actually the leaders come from struggling sectors.
Right, exactly. Like when I taught my MBA program for a while, one of the exercises I had the students do is I would say, pick your favorite Fortune 500, and I would say, go look at the board and tell me what percentage of people came from the founding business unit. And it's comical. It's always super, super high. And then what happens is sometimes a company goes through an evolution. Microsoft's a good example of this. Look at AWS. Jeff Bezos just stepped down. Part of that is to put some new blood into the company and kind of grow things and do things a little differently, right? Sergey and I forget the other guy's name.
Larry.
But anyway, Larry and Sergey, right? They go step away and they create Alphabet and go do this because they know they need to create a different leadership team. And even Apple's leadership team has changed a lot over the last few years, right?
Right.
And I think unless that happens, we're all a little trapped by our past history, right? And so we're going to use that frame to look at things. And that's one of the biggest challenges I see.
Right. And it seems like Bezos was cognizant of that from I say day one, because that's what he uses, day one versus day two.
Day
right.
One
so
stuff, right.
Yeah. Right. So a double entendre there. So very interesting. And to shift gears a little bit, you guys have a really fascinating piece of research on your site that I skimmed, to be honest. I haven't gone through all of it yet, but it's called B2B Breakups, 200 interviews with the ones that got away, which is just a great title. So I'd love to just hear, what did you learn? What surprised you, if anything?
Yeah. Well, the interesting, it's funny. I'm going to pull it up while we're talking, to be honest, because I didn't know you were going to bring that up.
I didn't mean to quiz you.
No, it's fine. It's just, that was an interesting study that we were able to do because we do a lot of win-loss interviews where we go out to an organization and we call their wins and we call their losses and we kind of figure out what happens and what made things work well. There's a few things there that come into play. One was the sales team not doing their homework and asking good questions like we talked about before. A big one in technology is ignoring the kind of current environment, no technology exists in isolation. Pretty much every technology has to snap to some other technology. I mean, everyone does. And so you've got a sales team that kind of acts like their technology doesn't inherently have to integrate with other things, or if it does so poorly, that's not that big of a deal. There's a lot more recognition of this over the last 10 years than there was 10 years ago, but sales teams will still tend to go in and kind of poo-poo the integration bit or imagine that it won't be that big of a deal. And it's one of the very first things that organizations are concerned about. Will I be able to connect this with the rest of the stuff that basically I already have in play? And the other one would be pricing models. I mean, it's kind of fascinating on the pricing model thing in SaaS, for example. Like we ended up with this bronze, silver, gold pricing so fast that almost like everybody has it. And those things tend to be fairly rigid. Or you have the mystery pricing. There's the group of people who kind of like, you have to call us to get the pricing. And then you get the pricing and it's not much different than the bronze, silver, gold kind of thing. So there's kind of a rigidity in the pricing models we see a lot that I think people they don't want to feel like they're buying a car and they never know if they got a good deal. Right. I don't know if that's what they want to return to, but there's times where it just feels so rigid that it's also not beneficial either. So that was another kind of opportunity we saw across all the interviews.
Right. And to understand that a little bit more, when people did leave, was they would talk about that? They would say we couldn't get this pricing structure we wanted, or like kind of how did that play out? Just to dig a little bit.
Yeah. I mean, basically they felt trapped into certain pricing tiers or terms of contract length or things like that. And that would drive them to move on to other folks. I mean, one of the easiest ways to lose as a long-standing SaaS solution is, you're around for a while, you have market dominance, so you keep increasing your term length. You're like, we have loyal, so now I'm going to make it 6 months. Now I'm going to make it a year. Now I'm going to make 3-year contracts or whatever you're going to do. And then somebody else shows up with really good functionality that gets back to the core thing you built, 10 years ago. And they offer bronze pricing for $4 a user. Right. And now you're asking, how could that ever happen? We have all these features. And it's like, well, you priced yourself up for the enterprise market. That's what happened. And so, it's things like that will drive people to kind of leave and create a kind of an excessive amount of churn.
Yeah, that makes sense. And let's talk a little bit about incentives for salespeople. And I think you touched on that a little bit. The last thing you said, where it's just the constant, age old problem of salespeople incentivized to close deals, but not make happy clients or customers. So are there any models that you've seen work really well? Is there anything that you've seen in your research where you're like, okay, this is actually a good way? And I know that your domain is tech, but I'd love to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I think we touched on some of it earlier. I mean, people want the sales team member to be a partner. They don't want them to just be trying to push for their own goals. I think I don't know. I'm thinking through all of the win-loss research we've done and like what's some of the more salient things. I mean, I think one of the, even beyond the study you mentioned, right? I'm just thinking of all the win-loss research. One of the things that leaps out to me is that a lot of times you have these kind of SaaS models where they have the sales development rep pool, right? Where you call in and like, it's John and Mary, and they might as well have a hexadecimal number next to their name because there's so many of them in the SDR pool, right? And like they don't really know a lot about the client's business. And so, you've got somebody trying to buy B2B software and they're in oil and gas, and they kind of want to talk to somebody that understands oil and gas. And the rep really only understands the basic pricing and the basic features. And so it's kind of that marrying a transactional sales model when there really needs to be something slightly more consultative. And so I think that's one of the bigger misses that we see. And the other thing, and this crosses over on the marketing side, this is more on the buyer's journey side, is that a lot of like sales and marketing teams, when they get together and say, who do we have to deal with the most in the sales cycle? They have kind of recency bias. They'll think about the last most important person in the chain, right? So we have to write a lot of content to the CIO. We have to write a lot of content to the CMO. We have to write a lot of content to the VP. And that's the person we need to gain access to. And what's interesting is when you're getting long to short list, you talk about the front end of the win-loss funnel or the buyer's journey. It's not a senior person who's searching for vendors, right? It's a fairly junior person. But if you look out at your average tech company and you try to look at their marketing and say, are they speaking to senior people or are they speaking to junior people? Inevitably, you're going to find they're speaking to pretty senior people. And then we'll go do the research and say, nobody senior comes to your site. And they'll go, okay. And I'll say, but did you look at your content? Like, you have this huge CIO portal, and they're like, well, people visit it. And I'm like, yeah, but they visit it later, like much later, right? If you're trying to gather leads in the front end, and every once in a while, there'll be somebody who does a really, really good job of that kind of grassroots marketing and pulling people up from the bottom. And so that's another place where I think there's kind of a miss sometimes.
Yeah, I think that's huge. And that's a really good point, where it's like with the senior people, yeah, you need to care about them, but it's so much later that they're almost like checking boxes. They're like, okay, are there any red flags here? My team's already vetted this, right. Are things in the right place? And it's like, you don't need to make piles of content for that problem. You need to be able to check your boxes.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. And you have to be willing to make your site look like it's appealing to a more junior user. And I think some of this is a little bit of an ego thing, honestly. I mean, I think it's hard. If you had two meetings in the universe, and in one, you're going to strategize to gain access to the manager of application development, and in another meeting, you're going to strategize to gain access to the CIO. Well, the last one sounds like more fun, right? I mean, if this was a military operation, it's like, let's invade and take over Western Europe, or let's invade and take over, this small nameless, Polynesian or island or whatever, right? It's the first one sounds more exciting. I get to play with bigger guns and bigger tanks, and we get to have a bigger strategy, and we have this huge conference for CIOs, and it's all, but I think it's won and lost more on like the individual one-on-one kind of thing with those smaller players. And, anyway, so that I could talk for a while about that, but that's one early piece of advice we noticed with a lot of tech companies is they've just aimed way too high title wise in almost all of their marketing.
Yeah, and I don't think it's just tech. I think it's everyone across the B2B.
Well, that's probably true. Yeah. Tech's
yeah.
our lane, but yeah, I imagine it's probably everywhere.
Yeah, it's what we see in the agency world too. So I know we're getting kind of towards the end of the time. So just a couple more questions. I think one, we talked a little bit about, or you covered buyer journey. I think what you hear a lot of across the B2B world is, well, the buyer journey is, conducted completely offline. Everybody does all their research, gets their ducks in a row, and then they contact, a vendor when they're just about ready to buy. So I'd just love to hear your thoughts on that. Does that map to the research you've conducted? Like, what are you seeing there?
Yeah, I mean, to a degree, I think it's certainly evolved. I mean, like if I charted even for us, the size of PO I can generate without being in person, or the number of meetings, like in year 2000, to generate any purchase order, I had to meet the client in person at least once, right? If not several times. Jump to now, like forget about COVID for a minute. So I guess just pre-COVID, right? I maybe could generate a couple $100,000 PO in our line of work without ever meeting a client, right? So there's definitely a change in that. Must imply that the buyer is willing to make a bunch of decisions without you around and that kind of thing. But you can still shape their information gathering, right? You can still do that for sure. And I do think this is particularly a point about services firms, because that's what we are. I think COVID exposed a lie that a lot of smaller and medium-sized service firms had been living on for years. I'm not talking about agencies, because they're inherently going to build good marketing for themselves, or you would hope. But you think you would, you would hope. That's why I said you'd hope. You never really, you look sometimes and you're like, whoa, nobody's spending time on this. But but if, compared to a lawn and garden service company, or, what I mean? Whatever. I mean, like I think the people who survived well in COVID had bothered to spend time on marketing beforehand, and services firms for years have lived off of. And if you think about it, rightly so, we hear a lot of conversation, completely rightly so, the savageness to the hospitality industry, the restaurant industry, all of this stuff that COVID brought. But I think someday we're going to see some really interesting statistics about services firms who were relying on like many services firms do, conferences, trade show presentations, flying to client sites, in-person referrals. You know what I mean? All of this activity that this last year just shut down like completely. And I wonder what happened to these guys. And I was just really thankful that we put a really good digital marketing engine in place years ago, because here's what we saw. We've had more leads this year than we've had any other year. Now I know we're in tech, but even so, we were able to do that, even though we haven't flown to a client site since last February. Right? We haven't been on set boots on ground on the campus of anybody for like a year and a half. And we wouldn't have been able to do it if we hadn't invested in all that marketing. And a lot of services firms kind of look at marketing and they kind of sneer at it, or, my business partner used to say our website existed to not disqualify us back in the day, a million years ago. It was that bad, like we had one, Yep. And I feel really sad for a lot of services firms that probably had a really rough year. And yet at the same time, there were other ones who had a good digital, door, and they honestly probably did better. Because here's where I'm going with this. All those people couldn't meet with anybody. The normal channels of conferences and trade shows got shut down. Mm-hmm. So they used Google as their therapist to go find a vendor. And if you'd bothered to invest beforehand in that, you're in a good place. And we all know, to put a bow on this, we all know that it isn't going to quite go back to what it was.
Right. Mm-hmm.
I mean, it might be a little harder to get on a campus as a vendor now. They might find a way to lock things down a little more. People might just be working from home a lot more. People have kind of, changed how they do things. I mean, the idea that everybody you might want to go meet, 80-20 is in a building somewhere. That fundamental principle just might not exist the same way. And so that's going to force the digital to just have a huge emphasis, even more so than it was before.
Yeah. And I think that's a huge sacred cow that's been killed, is like, I think the conferences that are going to survive are the ones that are fun, frankly. It's really that simple. Like CES and South by Southwest are going to be fine. Everything else that like pretty much everybody, kind of dreads going to, unless you're like, they're just, I just don't see that.
No, they're horrible. Yeah. I mean, no, I mean, the food is always bad. The networking is always like irritating, might be the best way to put it. You know what I mean? It's
and I've stood under those overhead lights at Javits Center in previous lives, and I'm just like, nobody wants to be there.
No, nobody. Yeah, you never know who the crowd's going to be, right? If you're the presenter, you eat bad food, you try to work on your laptop on your knees for 8 days while you tell yourself you're listening to sessions at the same time. I mean, and yeah, I think now I would say though, the other side will be incredibly rich, deep conferences that truly are providing value, that aren't just kind of like vanity sessions, right? Yeah. Like where we pick the guy from Coca-Cola, but he has nothing to say, kind of thing, right? I mean, which is so common, right? Right. But no, I completely agree. I think the conference industry will be very, very fascinating, kind of the business conference industry. It'll be very interesting to see what they do. I'm sure in the very beginning, they will just scramble to put money back in their coffers. Yeah. And they will offer any kind of event humanly possible. But after that, and probably the low attendance that will result, it'll be interesting to see how they reboot themselves.
Yeah, and we've had clients in that space, and they're already doing very interesting things. And I think predictably it's going more niche, going more immersive, right. Hybrid, shipping things to people, gifts before virtual events, et cetera. So yeah, definitely interesting. And Sean, kind of getting towards the end of our time, I know there's a lot you can't talk about, but I'd love to hear what you're working on that you can talk about, like any new projects, anything interesting. I know you have a podcast as well.
Yeah. Well, the overall, I can't say that much. So I'll just leave it at like, we're working with a lot of companies in B2B tech. I've mentioned a few during the show. So, we'll tend to do things like either research for them, buyer persona research, segmentation, competitive landscape, lots of message testing and brand work. And then we'll go off and we'll actually operationalize that into like marketing campaigns and messaging and tactics and that kind of stuff. And so it's, we like the lane we're in, we take a real data-driven approach. I say, to sum it up, like research firms tend to not want to deal with actually operationalizing the findings, and we'll help with that. And at times, when you look at your average agency model, they look at research as a little bit of the enemy sometimes, like, oh, some of the budget's got to go to research. I'm going to have to go find a research vendor, and that's great. Sometimes we get that work because they're looking for somebody. But to us, we feel like if we can lead with the research and drive things from a very actionable way, then to the thing we said a few minutes back, when push comes to shove in the meeting and the client's trying to say, well, I don't know if we should do this, we can be like, I don't know, 30 customers said you should. So your call, you can do it, gut instinct or N of 100, take your shot. I mean, I'll go with the survey results, but so it's a good place to be. But yeah, I wish I could say more about it, but I usually can't say too much in detail about an individual project, but always happy to chat with folks who are interested in working with us.
Yeah, no, that's super interesting. And that gives some good context. And beyond that, how can people reach you?
Just look up cascadeinsights.com. I'm on the site along with my business partner and a lot of bright, shiny faces of our team, and so, and as far as reaching out to me direct, it's just Sean, SEEAN at cascadeinsights.com. And one last thing on that, I am always happy to talk to an owner, a service firm owner, agency owner, even if you're not in our lane and there's no hope that we would ever work together. I'm happy to just talk to you about the life of owning a business. I love coaching and talking to people, and I know it can be a little lonely to be the business owner. I've been blessed to have a business partner for 20 plus years, so it can only get so lonely that way. But, there's some guys out there just doing their own thing, and they might just want to call somebody up and say, is it really this hard to find leads? Or what's the sales process really like? Or, how do I grow this thing? And always happy to talk about that. So folks could even reach out about that too, if they want.
Awesome. We'll get you linked up there. We covered about 1 million books that we'll also try to get linked up. And
okay,
yeah,
cool.
And there's so much more we could cover, I think, related to culture and sales training and just in entrepreneurship in general. So hopefully we'll get you back on in the future. And Sean, thank you so much for your time.
Hey, thanks for having me on, man. And thanks for letting us talk about F1 for a while. That was a lot of fun.
Yeah, of course. I want to do that more. So appreciate it. Thanks, man.
All right, bye.